Today, we become legends.
The 11.7 update is here and it's shaken up the meta a ton with a slew of balance changes to top and bottom performers and of course the returning items that are sort of dictating the new meta to a large extent. So I think it's time to update the top 3 gods for every role for the new patch. Quick disclaimer that this entry is very early in the patch cycle compared to when I usually would release these, so there's a bit more of my personal experience in this one than usual. But before we get into the top gods, let's talk about one of the top mobile games awarded Game of the Year in 2023, Honkai Star Rail, the free cross-platform tactical turn-based RPG. Update 2.3 brings huge things including new character Firefly, a member of the Stellaron Hunters who can don a mech suit and assume the identity of Sam, destroying all who oppose her in the process. As well as Jade, an opportunistic pawnbroker who will stop at nothing to earn a quick profit. In battle, she lashes out with whips and stomps her foes into the dust using high heels with her ultimate ability. Version 2.3 also brings back the fan-favorite characters Ran Mei and Argenti in the Warp. It's not just new and returning characters in Update 2.3 though, events such as the Simulated Universe season will bring new gameplay events and reworks to many in-game mechanics such as curios and blessings that can change character roles and gain unique combination bonuses depending on your champion selections. The Origami Bird event, the first ever PvP event in Honkai Star Rail, is also coming in Update 2.3. If you want to check out all this and more, be sure to download Honkai Star Rail from my link below and use these redemption codes to get even more free stuff in-game. Huge thanks to Honkai Star Rail for sponsoring this video. But with that said, let's jump in with the first role being solo lane. And my first pick for solo is probably no surprise to anyone who's played even one game of the new patch, that being the King himself. With Shield of the Phoenix bringing back Arthur's best item, that was the main reason he was so broken for so many years. He's naturally jumped back into his spot at the top of the meta. Arthur has even received quite a few buffs over the years to compensate for his loss of this item, and now he has it back, albeit in a slightly neutered form, but none of those buffs like damage mitigation on his passive have been reverted, so he is completely dominant right now. He can still build actual Glad Shield as well, which paired with Bluestone gives him plenty of damage in fights, and he of course uses the new Shifter Shield really well too. Arthur isn't completely infallible and can still struggle in the late game, but with the game being more snowball oriented than it has been in the recent years, you can very easily snowball your early game lead into his absolutely dominant mid game and get free wins off of that. Arthur is insane right now, as we all expected. Next up for solo is Mulan, who I do think has fallen off quite a bit after her nerfs and the nerf to Blackthorn Hammer. She can use Shield of the Phoenix, but isn't really the best user of it in the world. That said, she still does completely insane damage and can solo backliners for most of the game and is still really good right now. But she definitely has fallen off a bit in favor of some other rising stars like King Arthur. And my last pick for solo is another returning face from the last entry, that being Cthulhu. This guy remains completely insane, pun intended, in patch 11.7. As usual, his laning phase isn't the absolute best in the world and he can struggle in some lane matchups, but once you get into team fights, there's pretty much no other solo laner you'd want on your team more than Cthulhu. Being magical also gives him a small advantage into a lot of the Shield of the Phoenix spammers right now, as they want to rush that item, but it is physical defense based. He can even use the item himself pretty well, especially since his 1 while ulting now procs item effects. Cthulhu is still super good in 11.7. Quick honorable mentions to both Kukulkan and Artio for solo. Kukulkan was great last patch and remains so, even getting better with the addition of Shield of the Phoenix. Artio is similar in that she is probably the second best abuser of that item in the entire game, and it's single-handedly making her really strong in both solo and support. Moving on though, let's talk about some junglers, and much to no one's surprise, Erlang Shen is my first jungler. Quick mention that I do think he's viable in solo as well, but he's a much better jungler in my opinion. Giving Erlang his knockup back without reverting all of the other buffs he got in his rework in combination with bringing back Stonecutting Sword as a rush for him has just catapulted him into being far and away the best jungler, maybe even straight up the best god in the game in patch 11.7. He's got damage, he's got lockdown, he's got mobility, he's got good clear, he's just got everything you could possibly need from a jungler. Erlang is back in force and you should definitely be banning him if you don't plan to first pick him in ranked. Next up is a returning face for jungle though, that being Thor. He did get nerfed this patch but just refuses to leave the meta. He still does Thor things, being able to 100 to 0 at most stages of the game from his full ult combo, or half health you at any time from massive range with stun double tap. I do think the nerfs had an impact and he's definitely weaker than he was last patch, but still remains a top 3 jungler in my eyes. And finally for jungle, we have a similar story in Thanatos, who also has a semi-global and can one-shot you from out of nowhere. Much like Thor, I do think the nerfs have had an impact, probably more so for Thanatos, as nerfing his flat pen on the 2 was a massive hit to him. However, he's still pretty dominant as a jungler and just makes the list in my opinion ahead of a couple of other strong junglers. Those being my honorable mentions of Camazotz and Poseidon. Camazotz just remains strong as he was last patch, and Poseidon with Fatalis and his 2 is very underrated right now in my opinion. Moving on to mid though, which wasn't affected that much by this patch outside of a few specific nerfs, mid laners didn't really get any new toys with the returning items, so the meta remains much the same from last patch. First up is Chang'e, who is still one-shotting just the same and actually escaped any specific nerfs this patch. With the 11.6 changes, Chang'e can at bare minimum trade herself 1-for-1 pretty much guaranteed with a Blink ult combo. Her healing is ancillary but still nice to heal off stray hits from the front line, and her 2 is invaluable in a meta where you die to 2 abilities. Chang'e is still insane for mid right now. Next up is Ishel, who remains strong at 11.7. Not much has changed here either really, and the buffs she got recently to let her heal off of enemies with the ult were absolutely massive. She does great damage, has the most utility of any top mid laner right now, and is safer than you'd think with her ability to just 2 and 3 on herself for self-heal, and of course go CC immune with Omni movement and self-healing for a massive duration. She's very hard to get on and can poke from great range, making her actually very safe despite having no traditional dash. And finally for mid we have Agni, who did take some nerfs this patch, but they weren't that significant, and he still does completely insane damage from far ranges and over walls with his ultimate. There's not too much else to say about Agni. He's been in the meta for many months now and he remains strong at 11.7. Honorable mentions for mid go to Thoth, who is still super good right now, and Aphrodite, who I think is a little bit underrated at the moment as the counter to the burst meta. Moving on though, let's talk about the elephant in the room, that being the ADC role with the return of Haste and Fatalis. Freya is my first pick, and she's the reason I said Erlang's Shen only might be the best god in the game. Freya with the return of the infinite haste is an absolute force to be reckoned with in the meta, and the return of Ring of Hecate with flat pen is no slouch for her either, and really helps smooth out her early game power curve. Once you get those 2 items online, she already starts shredding, and much like a lot of other picks for this video like Arthur and Erlang, Freya actually received quite a few buffs fairly recently that were not reverted with the return of Fatalis, which just makes her even stronger. Freya is far and away the best ADC right now and in contention for straight up best god in the game. Next up though is a familiar face from last patch, that being Medusa. Despite not really using any of the returning ADC items that well and taking some nerfs in 11.7, Medusa is still doing insane damage this patch. I have her in the ADC role for the list, but she is of course a great mid laner as well and sees just as much play in that role as she does in ADC if you want to play her there. I just don't like including gods in 2 roles for the list to give some other picks the spotlight. You still can't go wrong with Medusa in 11.7. And finally for ADC we have Anhur, who's been in the meta for a long time now and remains strong in 11.7. While not quite on the levels of Medusa, he does have a really strong early game that can get a lead early on and snowball it. He's very versatile in terms of builds too, and can shred tanks way more effectively than Medusa or Freya with a kin size build if necessary, which it often is right now with how strong solo laners and supports are, plus the occasional bruiser jungle like Erlang. You all know Anhur, he's been in the meta for what seems like years at this point, and he's still strong in 11.7. Honorable mentions go to Charybdis and Kronos. Nothing has changed with Charybdis from last patch and she's still great. And Kronos has risen quite a bit from his buffs this patch, and for similar reasons to Freya, with Ring of Hecate and Fatalis making him a lot stronger. And finally, let's talk about supports where there has been some movement in the meta after 11.7. Most notably with my first pick in Kuzenbo, who was already strong prior to this patch, but the addition of hiding the Nemean Lion sort of pushed him over the edge into being the most annoying support in the game that can just sit on the backline with impunity. He has incredible disruption and surprisingly high damage even without the reflect shenanigans, but of course that is great at dealing with ADCs, especially Freya, who he can just stand in front of when she pops her 1 and 2 and completely shut her down. Kuzen is pretty insane right now. Next up is a returning face in Ares, who I think remains near the top of the support meta for yet another patch. There's not too much more I can say about Ares that hasn't already been said 1,000 times already, given how long he's been strong. His damage is insane, his lockdown is amazing, he has great matchups into a lot of the meta right now, most notably against Arthur, where his chain shut down half of his kit, but even into stuff like Erlang, he's great as it shuts down his burst damage when he can't use turtle form. Ares is still great in 11.7. And finally, my last pick for support is Bacchus, who also remains strong this patch despite some specific nerfs. He absolutely loves the addition of Shifted Shield into support builds as one of those supports that can dish out major damage with just a little bit of power. Having built-in anti-heal is also pretty valuable in the meta right now, given the substantial sustain with stuff like Shield of the Phoenix from solo laners, Erlang lifesteal, Chang'e Shell from mid, Freya lifesteal, etc. You all know Bacchus, he's been around for a while and remains so in patch 11.7. And honorable mentions for support go to Athena and Geb, who I think are still great right now, but just not quite top 3 in favor of the more aggressive picks available. But that's it for the top 3 gods for every role in Smite patch 11.7. Some roles have had huge shakeups and others not so much, but what do you think? It's very early in the patch cycle, but I think we're already seeing a solid meta emerge, especially in terms of key abusers of the returning items like Arthur, Erlang, Kuzenbo, and Freya. Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.